You know, it says here on my script that I am to be introduced by the voice of God. And so this confirms what I've always believed. God is indeed a woman. So I have been on a journey with this organization for more than a quarter of a century. 25 years ago, I helped negotiate a peace agreement for Angola, a country that had faced 20 years of civil war that had left 500,000 people dead and 3 million people homeless. I then asked President Clinton to name me the U.S. ambassador to Angola, and I went soon to Luanda. Right after I arrived, our embassy received a delegation from the Women's Refugee Commission. They had done an intensive survey of the peace process in Angola, and they had a simple message for us. The men who were leading the process, and yes, they were all men, were jeopardizing the chance to build a lasting reconciliation and resettlement of refugees because we were failing to engage women, people with disabilities, and other marginalized populations as part of the exercise of building peace in the country. They told us that we needed to have women be planners, implementers, beneficiaries, and leaders of that process. Another type of an NGO would have simply issued a report condemning us, but that's not what the Women's Refugee Commission does. And so they met with us and they spelled out specific recommendations that we could use to empower women and to build an inclusive, diverse, and equitable peace process. And over the next 3 years, we partnered with the Commission to complete these steps. And I firmly believe they were the key to bringing peace of a lasting nature to Angola just a few years later. Since then, I've continued to rely on the expertise and the wise counsel of the Women's Refugee Commission in my work in Haiti, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Zimbabwe and beyond. And that is why I am so honored to serve on the board of this great organization. And I can assure you that it looks just as good from within as it did from the outside. It is my honor now to present the Voices of Courage Awards to 3 groups that have provided the Commission and the entire United States and the world with vital legal support over the past decade. And I'll begin with Orrick, Herrington, and Sutcliffe. In 2009, Orrick contributed countless hours in pro bono research and monitoring for Halfway Home, which was the Commission's landmark study of the conditions of care and confinement for children going through immigration proceedings without a parent or guardian. More than 30 Orrick attorneys and paralegals crisscrossed this country to monitor conditions, to interview children and staff, and as a result, Halfway Home continues to be the go-to resource for how the system for unaccompanied children should work. And Orrick continues to provide invaluable legal support to the Commission. And so for its generous pro bono contributions to protecting the rights of women and children who are seeking safety in the United States, I'm honored to present this 2019 Voices of Courage Award to Kathy Crost of Orrick, Herrington, and Sutcliffe. Thank you.
Thank you for those kind words, and thank you so much to the Women's Refugee Commission for this award. It has been such an honor for Orrick to work with the Women's Refugee Commission on issues relating to unaccompanied children. The Women's Refugee Commission has been a leader on these issues for a long time. Back in the 1990s, their advocacy resulted in the transfer of custody of unaccompanied children from what was then the Immigration and Naturalization Service, whose job was to prosecute and deport undocumented immigrants. That's who used to take care of these children, to the Department of Health and Human Services, which brought a social services approach to the custody of unaccompanied children. This was a huge victory for children. In addition to the Halfway Home report mentioned by Ambassador Steinberg, Orrick worked with the Women's Refugee Commission on a protocol for Border Patrol agents to screen for trafficking victims, and most recently, on proposed new regulations implementing the Flores Consent Decree, which governs the treatment of unaccompanied children in federal custody. And the leadership of the Women's Refugee Commission continues today. You may have seen Michelle Brannet, Senior Director of the Migrants' Rights and Justice Program, giving testimony to many congressional committees. Michelle and other representatives of the Women's Refugee Commission have also been interviewed on CNN, MSNBC, the BBC, PBS, and they're cited frequently in the New York Times, The Guardian, and many other publications. We look forward to continuing to support the Women's Refugee Commission in this important work. Thank you again for this award.
We actually need to. Thank you, Kathy. Today's second honoree is Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. Paul Weiss has been a valued partner in our work to respond to immigrant family separation crises. Through its lead role on the steering committee of the ACLU's Ms. L family separation case. You may recall that this case began with a claim to reunite an asylum-seeking mother from the Democratic Republic of the Congo with her 7-year-old daughter, who was wrongfully separated from her at the border by U.S. immigration officials about 18 months ago. This case now, Ms. L, has become the landmark class action on family separation, representing thousands of immigrant families. Paul Weiss coordinates the steering committee through which the Commission and its partners address the interests of parents deported without their children following separation. Paul Weiss has led the charge by reaching out to hundreds of deported parents and coordinating reunification with their children. For its generous pro bono contributions to protecting the rights of women and children seeking safety in the United States, I'm honored to present the 2009 Voices of Courage Award to Steve Herzog of Paul Weiss. Thank you.
In early August of last year, the ACLU asked Paul Weiss to head the steering committee it was forming to work on reunifying families that had been separated as a result of the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy. We had already been involved in challenges to child separation, as well as challenges to the Muslim ban. But this was a commitment on another scale. Working with WRC, as well as Kids in Need of Defense and Justice in Motion, our other two NGO partners, we spent thousands of hours contacting parents and hearing about the worst moments of their lives. These parents had gone through enormous hardships to escape persecution in their home countries, only to arrive in the United States to have their children forcibly taken from them. Some of the parents were told by government employees that there was no longer asylum for people like them. Others were tricked into signing documents that waived their right to seek asylum by a promise that their child would be on the airplane home with them. But all were then deported to their home countries while their children remained in the United States in government custody. Their stories are both compelling and heartbreaking. Our team spent much of the next 6 months trying to find these parents, to hear their stories and counsel them on their options. We had to find parents who were still in hiding, fearing the same persecution that had led them to flee in the first place. And we had to work with families that were struggling with complicated family issues and problems. And we had to deal with language issues and translators, not only to deal with mostly Spanish speakers, but many speakers of indigenous languages, a whole variety of languages. More than 100 Paul Weiss attorneys participated in this work. And with the enormous efforts of our team and our NGO partners, we ultimately were able to contact a parent of every child who remained in government custody. I've worked at Paul Weiss for nearly 30 years, and I have never been more proud of our firm than I am for the efforts of the many lawyers who committed their time and their resources and their expertise to this effort. I had an incredible team working with me on this effort, and I can't thank everyone here today, but I do want to single out 3 lawyers who were the core of my team and without whom this effort would not have been possible. Thank you to B.J. Jensen, Dave Marshall, and Elizabeth Grossman. I also want to thank all of our NGO partners, including, of course, our WRC colleagues. I'm honored to be accepting this recognition on behalf of Paul Weiss and my team, and thank you again to WRC for all that you do on behalf of women and children.
You know, it shouldn't have to be this way. We should have a government that cooperates with people trying to build the rights for refugees to this country, and hopefully we will soon be back to that status again. Today's third award goes to Steptoe and Johnson. Steptoe and Johnson has provided critical support to protect unaccompanied children, specifically under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. That act requires the screening of all children apprehended at the border to determine if they may be victims of trafficking or subject to persecution. Steptoe and Johnson's expert guidance has helped ensure that these children are properly screened and protected from the risks of trafficking. They've also taken on many individual cases and supported our work with legal analysis, including compiling critical comments on standards in the Prison Rape Elimination Act and a detailed briefing paper on avoiding adverse impacts of children of ICE enforcement practices. For its generous pro bono contributions to protecting the rights of women and children seeking safety in the United States, I'm honored to present this 2019 Voice of Courage Award to Paul Lee of Steptoe and Johnson. This is going to be wonderful. Thank you so much. Can you get this out of the way?
Thank you, Ambassador Steinfeld. On behalf of my colleagues at Steptoe, I graciously accept this award recognizing our pro bono work with the Women's Refugee Commission, a wonderful partnership that stems back over a dozen years for us. I'm here with one of our senior partners, George Grandison, who worked very tirelessly with the WRC team on that work on the TVPRA. The TVPRA is a law that has protected thousands and thousands of women and children fleeing persecution, and it is under attack today. So I encourage you to contact your senators and congressmen and tell them to stand up on behalf of the TVPRA. We know that when our lawyers team up with the incredible advocates on staff at the WRC, our work will have maximum impact during a time when we cannot afford to be inefficient with our legal resources. There are far too many dire needs and causes worth fighting for, all crucial in their own right, and yet only a handful of those dedicated enough to fight on the front lines of justice. Steptoe is so grateful to the WRC for thinking strategically about how to improve the complex network of immigration and refugee laws, both in our country as well as abroad. We know that the efforts we put forward with the WRC will pay off great dividends in securing important litigation victories, enacting wide-reaching systemic changes, and in the end, creating more pathways to safety, stability, and peace for those fleeing atrocities around the world. Thank you to the Women's Refugee Commission for this wonderful honor and for continuing to be a voice of courage and compassion for so many. Have a happy 30th birthday.